We are going to be ranking every Call of Duty Zombies boss fight from worst to best. Boss fights in Zombies started around Black Ops 3, or they became at least a lot more mainstream from that game and then on. And typically in a list like this, I would only include Treyarch boss fights, but I'm actually going to be including Infinite Warfares as well. I won't be including anything like Exos or World War II, mainly because I couldn't be bothered to play those games, but also because IW genuinely has some really good boss fights that I think Treyarch could learn a lot from in future projects, and just zombie games in general, and they're really good examples of just how boss fights are structured to begin with. Also, the parameters that I'm ranking these boss fights are the depth of their mechanics and how well balanced and rewarding they are from like a gameplay perspective in terms of like rewarding smart play and stuff like that. Just basic design stuff for boss fights. But yeah, I did take to task to playing every single CoD Zombies boss fight, so if you guys wouldn't mind leaving a thumbs up, I worked really hard on this, that'd be great. Subscribe if you're brand new, and let's get started. So coming in at the very bottom of this list is the Beast from Beyond Cryptid boss fight, and everything is wrong about it. Mechanically, the way the map itself is laid out, the way the enemies work, everything is just wrong. So let me explain how this is set up. Obviously, this isn't really a traditional Zombies boss fight. As being DLC 4 for IW, they decided to bring back the cryptids from Extinction, and in theory, I think on paper that is a pretty good idea and could work. The thing is with Extinction, though the enemy type are obviously not zombies, meaning they move a lot faster, they can teleport, there's more of them, but they don't deal as much damage as a typical zombie. The way that the health system in Extinction worked and how much damage you take per cryptids was very complex and intricate, whereas in this Beast from Beyond boss fight, they just deal the same damage as a regular zombie, but move at like 6x the regular speed. It is absolutely broken. You have no choice but to continually move around, and especially if you're playing solo, and you're going to get body blocked by these big player models or these big cryptid models a lot, and the fact that they deal the same damage as a zombie, this is the most mashy boss fight of my entire life. And not only that, there is a sequence in the middle of the boss fight where you need to survive for 100 seconds, but the catch is that it's not a real 100 seconds. Basically, a real life 1 second, or it takes about 1.25 seconds of this clock. So while it says 100 seconds, you're like, oh, it's a little over a minute and a half, I can do that, and it ends up being about like 2 minutes, more closer to that. Just like everything is wrong. However, I will say I can kind of see the vision of what Infinity Ward was probably going for, or the nugget of the idea that they wanted to execute in this map, but the problem is, again, it's just nothing works in this boss fight. It's not only incredibly frustrating, it's unbalanced and broken, it's also just not very exciting. You're in just like this really bland facility, running around it probably like over 20 or 30 times in a row, just shooting rhinos that are absolute bullet sponges. I don't know, there's not a whole lot to this boss fight that I really like, and I think given a little more time to develop this one and really flesh it out and balance it, actually could have been pretty good, but a lot of the attention from IW was pulled off onto something else, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, this boss fight really got the short end of the stick. I get the impression somehow that they were a little bit pressed for time and resources, and this was kind of just slapped together. Like, you really get that vibe when you play it, and you know, again, I can see the nugget of the idea. It just didn't necessarily play out how I'm sure they wanted to, but it was a unique idea nonetheless, and it's at least memorable, I'll say that. So coming up just after that is Firebase Z, and there's a reason I'm starting this clip at the cutscene of this map. This boss fight, if I can do a boss fight in under 20 seconds under any circumstance, it's probably not a very good boss fight in most cases, and Firebase Z is basically the epitome of that. The only reason I'm ranking it a little bit higher than Beast from Beyond is this boss fight is actually functional, right? The mechanics make sense, that there is an actual boss that, you know, isn't unbalanced or broken. It's just unbelievably easy to kill and cheese, and it's not very exciting either. You basically just have a wall that you need to deal damage towards. It's the same boss enemy as what we've already encountered in the map, so nothing too crazy or extraordinary there. It's just very, like, low tier. This boss fight could have been much better with a few small tweaks. Give the Orda a lot more health, make it significantly harder to kill, maybe make him move around a little bit, and have some variation in depth of his attacks. Other than that, there really isn't too much to say about Firebase Z. It's a very low tier boss fight, and maybe this was a time constraint thing, I'm not really sure. Either way, it doesn't really matter. One of the weakest boss fights in Cold War and Zombies in general. Next up, just after that, is the second Outbreak Easter egg boss fight, and this is already a step above Firebase Z, which ironically actually has the exact same boss. It's another Orda, but this one's different not only because the mechanics are more in depth. There's a ticking clock element, which means you need to beat the boss fight in under 5 minutes and 30 seconds. The Orda, in contrast to Firebase Z, can actually move around this time. It throws out more attacks, and it also has a mechanic that it can heal itself if you get too far away from it, or if you don't deal damage in a long enough amount of time. So, and plus the enemy spawns are much heavier. It's a lot more intense, and it's very sandboxy. I'm actually, I'm not the biggest fan of this boss fight. It's not great in comparison, but it's, passable, right? It's still pretty low tier, but, it's at least not embarrassing as a boss fight. Realistically, the only way I would look to improve this boss fight is to make the main antagonist or the main enemy not an Orda. Not only have we already fought it in Firebase Z, you literally encounter the exact same Ordas just as you're playing the game in world events, so it takes a lot of the weight away from that and makes it feel less special. And even just a different kind of enemy, doesn't have to go too crazy or anything, but could really at least help it set apart as an identity for the second Outbreak Easter egg. I didn't expect too much out of this to begin with, but it's about what I expected it to be, which is an adequate boss fight, but nothing very special or even that memorable. It's okay. Next up is Zetsubou no Shima, and you could say this map actually has two separate boss fights, one of them being the Mother Spider, which is a more mid-game boss fight, which is a pretty cool concept. They really introduced that with this map, and I think they could go a lot further with that going forward into future projects, and it's a really good idea. The fight itself isn't incredibly complicated. You just have to deal damage to the spider. It takes, around 30 seconds or so. It's very simple, but it's effective. Now, the problem is the main boss fight itself against Takeo in the prison cell is very underwhelming, and it's kind of just boring. And look, don't get me wrong, I'm not implying that every single boss fight has to be over-the-top exciting and bombastic stuff like that, but at least it needs to feel like a boss fight, or for the boss itself to have a presence. It's one of my main problems with boss fights is when the actual main enemy isn't that much of a threat, and it really feels like that in Zetsubou no Shima. It's the most unexciting boss fight I think you could possibly make. Not only do you really not have to kill anything in here if you don't want to, you pretty much just wait it out for these vulnerable positions to open up, so you can shoot it with one bullet of one wonder weapon, and you do that 4 times, and the actual main boss has one attack. That's practically it. Other than that, you just avoid thrashers and spiders, which I don't like for my own personal reasons. They're not particularly fun enemies. I feel like you take a lot of undeserved and just random damage from these, and I don't know, it's just not that good. I really feel like Zetsubou's boss fight is the Firebase Z of Black Ops 3. And that's not to imply any amount of quality on not only the map itself, but the main Easter egg, but just the boss fight in a bubble is it's probably the weakest boss fight in Black Ops 3, which with a few tune-ups and some changes could have been significantly better. Was it going to be one of the best? I highly doubt it, but it could have been made much better with a few small changes. Coming up just after that is Dead of the Night, and this is the werewolf boss fight. I played this very recently when trying to record this video, just so I have the most clear-headed opinion of this, and I feel like this boss fight, just more endemic of the map, is it's got the problem of a really good atmosphere and vibe, but not super solid gameplay to back it up. And this boss fight it's not bad, don't get me wrong, by any means this is not a bad boss fight, but I think it is pretty mediocre compared to a lot of them. The mechanics aren't incredibly complicated, and the main boss itself isn't that much of a threat, all things considered, and in fact it's invisible for most of the boss fight. You essentially do a few phases where you turn these statues to face a certain tile, and when they're all facing it, the werewolf will approach you, and once it enters that ring, obviously, then it will become visible and vulnerable, and you can attack it, and you do that a couple of times. It's mediocre, it's definitely passable. Because the boss itself is invisible for 90% of the fight, sometimes you kind of forget that's what you're fighting. It's more of a fight against the just regular zombies in the map than it is against the werewolf itself. He might attack you every once in a while he's invisible, and you'll be like, oh, I just took damage, I guess this thing still exists. But I don't know, it's not a great presence in the map itself. It's, again, very mediocre, passable boss fight. Not one of their best examples of good fights, certainly not one of the worst, and is very, very mid-tier, I would say. After that, however, is going to be Shaolin Shuffle, which in its own bubble, again, I really do like as a fight, and I could really see the vision of what they were going for with the Rat King in this kind of circumstance, but I think this boss fight was a little bit fumbled in execution. You are fighting the Rat King in the lower sewers, and you have 3 different challenges that you have to do before you can really deal damage to the actual Rat King. You have Pam Grier here to help you out and assist you, and I'm pretty sure if you're playing the actual Easter egg version of this rather than the boss battle mode, Pam Grier will pretty much infinitely revive you in solo, so it's essentially impossible to fail. But you have 3 sequences. A couple of them include you like shooting zombies to kill these area of effect pools that are these little green sludge marks on the ground. One of the challenges, you have to find these like icons around the map that you can only see with a certain vision tool, and that's again really cool stuff. I think the ideas were very neat, and then after doing all 3 of those challenges and objectives, can you really deal damage to the boss? But the Rat King itself again isn't a major threat. There's not a whole lot he can do to you outside of the zombies, and again they end up being more of a threat than anything. The challenges are kind of silly or goofy. They're not that great in my opinion, but they're passable and they're fine. It's a fun fight, not one of my favorite though. Next up, though, is going to be Revelations on Black Ops 3. This one, I honestly, I quite like it, and it's split up into 2 boss fights, which, ironically, the first part of the boss fight is actually way better than the finale, but essentially, the first part of the boss fight brings you to this room, and you fight off 4 different waves and sequences of Margwas that all have, like, a different attribute applied to the room. So, for example, you can have the anti-gravity enabled, where you're jumping around all over the place. You can have other obstacles and, like, you know, sort of hazards in the room that can kill you as well. But you just have to kill 4 waves of Margwas, and then you go back into the room for the finale, in which you basically just charge the summoning key with souls. So you have to get a few kills. You throw it into the Sophia Ghost, and it shoots the laser. It's basically the Shadows of Evil boss fight, but a little bit dumbed down in my opinion. This one can also be done fairly quickly as well, depending on how efficient you are. It's not a complete, like, freebie, but if you know what you're doing and you're optimizing, this boss fight is not only significantly easier than, like, the Midway boss fight in Revelations, but is probably one of the easiest boss fights in general. Now, actually, there is a theory that this was meant to be really easy, as basically the way they were taking the story, the Shadow Man wasn't exactly supposed to be dead from this boss fight. It was supposed to feel like it was unearned for a reason, from what I understand, so it had a lot more to do with, like, storyline rather than gameplay, but it's not one of my favorite boss fights in general. It's okay. Coming up just above that is going to be Blood of the Dead on Black Ops 4. So this one was honestly more or less just disappointing in comparison to what this could have been. I really do think this would have, like, it is a bit of a missed opportunity to at least not have this boss fight take place on, like, the Golden Gate Bridge or something like that. An absolutely iconic piece of regular Mob of the Dead that just doesn't really make an appearance in Blood, and it's a little bit of a shame. That aside, though, the actual boss fight itself is quite simplistic. I tend to not like maps that will make the main boss of the map a slightly larger version of the mini boss that we've already seen as we're going about our business playing it, and I'm sure a lot of you guys share that similar sentiment. It's just like, it takes a little bit away from the surprise, from the grandiosity, and I think Blood of the Dead is literally just an extra large Brutus, and it's not that exciting in all honesty. Like, the coolest part is the fact that, you know, whoever's playing Richthofen has to get in the machine at the end of it, or, like, you know, it'll spawn a bot if you're playing solo. That stuff's kind of cool. That's really neat, I won't lie. But another detrimental thing to this boss fight is, and this is a lot of BO4 fights in general, you actually need the zombie shield in order to, you know, progress through this one, as you have to charge up the main, like, power generator on the center console. But if your shield breaks for any reason whatsoever and you don't have a way to replace it through elixirs, you cannot continue the boss fight, and in my opinion, that is bad game design. Now, luckily, your shield doesn't break that often in BO4 unless you make a terrible, tremendous mistake, but if you're playing solo, you've got, like, one shot at it, and if your shield breaks and you didn't get all the way through it, you're kind of screwed, and I'm not a huge fan of that. I think it would have been far more interesting to have the Mega Brutus follow you around a lot more closely in the fight and, like, throw out attacks that are unique to him that you need to, like, read and react to as you're doing the typical, you know, devices that you go up doing this fight and charging up the orbs and stuff like that, alongside dodging this Mega Brutus and his new attacks. I think that would have been pretty neat. The boss fight could have ended the same way, but I think it needs a little more substance. Coming up next is going to be D Machine's boss fight on Cold War Zombies. This was obviously the on-disc map and the first boss fight that you will most likely encounter when playing it. Now, while this isn't the most intricate or even even difficult boss fight in the world. I do like the formula switch up where you kind of think you're going to be fighting Orlov in this, where you're actually protecting him while he goes and takes down 3 different generators, and that's a pretty interesting flip on the concept of what we thought it was going to be, and for that I'll give it credit. My only real problems with this boss fight is that the stakes are almost zero in terms of the actual fight itself. Orlov cannot die in the current build of the game, which I'm probably pretty sure in development of this, they actually had Orlov have a health bar and he could die if he got, swarmed by too many zombies, but perhaps this was deemed to be difficult for newer players that were being onboarded during Cold War. It's exactly how some of the objectives in Outbreak work, where you have to defend a certain location or an object that actually can take damage, and if it dies or if it breaks, your game will completely fail. So I assume in early development of D Machine, they actually made it so Orlov could take damage, and if he died, that would mean and result in a failure of the boss fight, but it was changed, and I would say that's my biggest criticism of it. But all in all, it's a neat idea, it's a neat concept, and the boss fight arena itself is laid out pretty well, and it just flows nicely. So not the greatest boss fight in the world, but it's definitely passable and a decent amount of fun to play. Up next, we have Alpha Omega on Black Ops 4 Zombies, and admittedly, I'm not the biggest fan of the map itself, and it's pretty obvious this was roughly the point in which zombies started to have the ramifications of their big budget cuts around this time. Alpha Omega was supposed to be a lot more than it was, but at least the boss fight in and of itself is relatively good fun, and it's intact. It's not too complicated, and it involves you fighting the Avogadro that featured, or at least debuted in Black Ops 2 Zombies. He pretty much follows you around the underground Nuketown bunker facility while you have to fill up these like 4 soul generators, and you're locked in to these different sections of the bunker, which you have to collect, like, I don't know, I think it's 30 or 50 souls, something like that. But the neat little twist on this boss fight is you actually don't fight any zombies at all. You fight the ADM units or the mannequins that are infamous on Nuketown, and that is, a subtle touch, but they're stronger than the average zombie, and it makes the boss fight feel a lot more intense than it probably would be with just, regular zombies in and of itself. The Avogadro also has a few different attacks that are relatively easy to read, and he's not like a massive presence in the boss fight as you fill up souls, but other than that, it's your average like soul box boss fight where you just fill up 4 different ones, and then you do have one unique step at the end of the boss fight where you have the Avogadro in the APD that he spawned, and you actually have to push him back in there. And while it's a little goofy in execution, I think it's a really neat idea, and the step itself, it's kind of fun to do, and like the scuffed mechanics kind of remind me of how the Avogadro originally functioned and felt like in Black Ops 2 Zombies. So it's a nice little homage to that, whether they intended it to be or not. But otherwise, pretty cool boss fight. Not a great cutscene, but a decent setup nonetheless. Next up, we have Shadows of Evil's boss fight on Black Ops 3, and you might ask yourself, okay, this is pretty similar to the Revelations boss fight, but I think Shadows of Evil, while it technically can be done pretty quickly if you're efficient and you know what you're doing, this boss fight can be one of the most difficult boss fights if you mess up a few times, and because every time you mess up a sequence, another Margot will spawn in. Not only that, but the room itself and the actual layout makes this boss fight more difficult than the Revelations build because of the wall running mechanic, and you pretty much only have half the map to work with at any given time, and also the Shadow Man moves around a lot more erratically in this one. Now, interestingly, the more sequences you fail in this boss fight, the longer it takes for the Shadow Man to reset itself back in its shield, so it gives you more of a mercy window every time you mess up, but other than that, it's just like a really good, fun boss fight. It can be completely cheesed and broken depending on what you run, but if you really want to give yourself a challenge, the Shadows of Evil boss fight with like really low-powered guns is unironically a really difficult time, so pretty good. The step after it can only be done co-op for the most part, but the boss fight itself is fairly neat. Raven the Redwoods, which was Infinite Warfare's DLC 1 map. Now, I don't think this is IW's strongest example of a really good boss fight, but in terms of other boss fights and what you could compare it to, this one is really good, and the design is pretty ingenious. So basically, you're fighting the Kevin Smith version of the Super Slasher, and in this, you are in rave mode as you collect souls on 2 different locations, and it takes, honestly, quite a lot of them, but you fill both of them up to make this ring in which you have to lure the Super Slasher into. You then, fire on him when he's in the ring, and that'll bring him back, pull him into the real world. However, he still has a shield, and it's represented by these small little icons that'll pop up all over his body that you have to shoot down. There's like 10 or 15 of them, and this boss fight is pretty long. You have to do a few sequences of this, and if you're playing efficiently, this boss fight will take you probably anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes, maybe even 20 minutes if you're playing slowly. So it's not something you can just completely bypass and blow through, even if you're good at it. Like, it's gonna take you a long time no matter what, and the sequences themselves are all very like distinct. You know what step you got to do next once you get a feel for it, and it's pretty difficult. Now, I will say my only criticism is that the Super Slasher itself isn't that much of a threat. Like, it looks like his attacks are going to do a lot of damage or even insta-kill you, but they don't do a whole lot. The zombies end up being more of a threat than actually the main boss, which is a little bit disappointing, but I really think they made him overpowered. This boss fight could easily be potentially too hard for the average player, so they made him more of a visual threat than anything, but he's still nothing to scoff at. Coming up just after that is going to be Ancient Evil, and for the most part, I really like this boss fight, and the concept is neat, and the location is probably one of my favorite, but I'm not in love with the layout, nor am I in love with the way it kind of forces you to play. So you're essentially fighting Pegasus for the most part, where he'll come around, he flies, and you have to shoot him out of the sky, and you basically have to use the Hellion Salvo, which for all Black Ops 4's intent, kind of making you, giving you the freedom to play how you want to play. You're not given that many options when it comes to this boss fight, and the way that you actually deal damage to Pegasus can really only be done through a specialist weapon as well. But other than that, the boss fight itself is pretty fun, and it's very, very unique. Very rarely are we ever fighting some kind of aerial enemy in zombies, and maybe that's not something I want all the time, but for Ancient Evil, this was a really good mix-up, and another problem I guess I have with this one is the fact that the boss fight arenas, there's basically 3 different platforms, and you get less and less space to work with as the fight goes on, which sometimes that can lead to intensity, but sometimes that can also just be rather annoying, and especially in BO4, sometimes you can get max ammos and other drops to spawn on areas of the map that you can't even access, which is a little bit of a design flaw in this fight, but other than that, it is fairly fun. Coming up just after that is a boss fight that could have been, it is really good, don't get me wrong, but it could have been much better, and this is going to be Black Ops 4's 9 boss fight. So in terms of like visuals, I'm going to give this 10 out of 10, 5 stars. It is amazing in terms of like a visual spectacle. Gameplay, however, is lacking a little bit. The problem is it's basically all bark, no bite. You have the visual of like seemingly thousands of gladiators running out of the gates at once, but they're not that hard to kill, and they can be wiped out like they're regular zombies, sometimes if not even easier. And then you have the 2 large elephants that come out as being the main boss, and again, visual spectacle, but in reality, they're not that much of a threat, and they can be taken out absurdly easy. And since there's 2 of them, they had the opportunity, I guess, to reveal like a different kind of enemy, and I know at Treyarch, they were actually toying with a couple of different types of enemies that weren't elephants that were going to come out of these gates, but they ultimately ended up going with these. They had the opportunity to just, reveal something else crazy that would come out, and potentially something way harder, but it's basically just the exact same elephant that came out of the first gate, which is just as easy to kill as the one before. So it feels a little repetitive. It doesn't feel like it builds up to anything besides the elephants themselves. Again, all visual spectacle, but the gameplay elements are severely lacking. The boss fight arena itself is also a lot bigger than it probably should be for the intensity that you maybe want to feel. Up next is going to be DLC 4 on Cold War Zombies Forsaken, and in this boss fight, you literally fight the Forsaken himself, and for all it's led up to be, again, same problem as 9, amazing visual spectacle, and I think that's its strongest suit, but the gameplay feels somewhat lacking and hollow in this fight. Now, I do think this is probably the, I guess, vision they may have had for Firebase Z's boss fight, something along these lines, and it is a lot more complex and intricate than that fight. Is it amazing? Not exactly, but it's a step in the right direction for Cold War Zombies boss fights and for Treyarch boss fights in general. There's not a whole lot to say about it. It's pretty straightforward. You just have to break the Forsaken shields and then shoot it with some, actual turrets after filling up one simple soul box, and you do that a couple of times. Nothing too crazy, and the boss fight itself, or like the actual enemy, doesn't feel like that much of a threat for the most part. There isn't a whole lot he can do to you if you're paying attention, so it is what it is. Again, visual spectacle is amazing, but the gameplay does ring hollow every time I play it. But again, step in the right direction, and I hope they continue to iterate on stuff like this. Coming up next, though, is a weird one. It's definitely not the best boss fight, but it may be the most interesting one on this list. So this is Attack of the Radioactive Thing on Infinite Warfare, and I cannot stand to play the Easter egg on this map, but the boss fight I will play again and again. So this is fighting Krogzilla, and it's basically the exact opposite problem of 9 and Forsaken. The visuals on this boss fight are terrible. Literally looks straight out of a PS2 game. I don't know if they were intentionally going for something a lot more sloppy sloppy looking to fit into the theme and the aesthetic of the map. I'm not really sure, but it doesn't look good from a visual perspective, but that's fine because the gameplay is pretty stellar. It's got a bunch of different unique phases in which you have to ship a bomb down from the top to the bottom of the beach to get the bomb in Krogzilla's mouth. Getting it down to the beach is difficult because there's an onslaught, an absolute relentless barrage of meteors and Krogs and stuff like that. You then have to shoot a vulnerable spot with these random turrets around the map a couple of times in its weak point as it tries to shoot you with a laser, and after you've done that, you then get pushed to the back of the beach where you started, and you then have to avoid not only a sequence of zombies and a relentless onslaught of a couple of waves of more meteors and Krogs, but then the real fun begins. When it comes time to approach Krogzilla and you survived all of those sequences, he's then gonna spawn in these lasers that are either ground level or at slide or crouch level. So this means you then have to maneuver through this maze of lasers to even get there, and they will practically insta-kill you if you touch them even for just a second. So you have to have nearly perfect movement to get down to the bottom of the beach, and it's also on a time crunch, so you have to be very quick and precise about it. And then once you get into the stomach, you then have to input a couple of digit code that the selector on it moves really quickly, and if you miss 3 times, then it'll kick you off, and if you mess it up a couple of times, it'll kick you out of the stomach and you have to do that sequence again. It's really unique. Is it the best designed boss fight? Absolutely not, by no stretch of the imagination, but it is incredibly unique. It's just something different. So it's one of those ones that just you want a nice mix up. It's a lot of fun to play. After that is going to be what some may not consider to even be a boss fight, but I wanted to include it on this list. This is the ending of Togder Toten. Technically speaking, there is no main shoot the guy villain in this one, but it does have a final sequence which involves you staying within this certain area, this orb that transports you all around the map. The map completely changes as well, where all of the water then becomes lava that can damage you, and it's incredibly intense. You get a full map tour, and the ending sequence itself is great. Again, I think many people were expecting to have an actual boss for this map, and obviously if you know about Black Ops 4's history, that Togder Toten wasn't really supposed to be the final map for this. This was going to be in a Season 2, so it's entirely possible that either they just didn't have time to make an actual boss for this map, or this was going to be how the map played out, but something else was supposed to be the grand ending. Either way, I do like the subversion a little bit, where it's we all expected to have a really grand boss fight, but it ends up being this little sequence where we take this ether orb back to the facility, and it's super simple concept, but that doesn't mean it's easy. I give it points for being visually really interesting. I mean, honestly, all of this red probably looks just great on YouTube compression, but when you play it for yourself, it does look really good. However, it's not that hard. You still have to stay on your toes. There is a threat of dying, especially at the very end where the circle pretty much completely collapses on you. If you don't have anything to cover yourself, you'll probably die as you have to survive there for quite a long time. But other than that, it really isn't that hard. It's just a lot of fun. And not to mention, after the sequence is done, obviously much of Togder Toten is just an exposition dump. That's many of the steps, and even this ending to some degree. But once you've actually completed this sequence, going out and exploring the rest of the map, as it's so quiet and peaceful, and you can see this just actual visual masterpiece in front of you without the distraction or worrying about zombies, is amazing. And I don't think we spent enough time really letting this soak in, because pretty much the ending happens directly after. But other than that, great visual spectacle at the very end, and the step itself is pretty interesting despite it not having a main villain or main boss fight. But other than that, Togder Toten actually gets an above average in my book for its final sequence. Next up though, we have Dreisendrach's boss fight, and again, DLC 1 on BO3. This really started out swinging, and this boss fight is great. It's more endemic of how I feel about the map in general, where I basically mentioned if there was ever something that was considered a perfect zombies map, it would be DE. And I would also say this is the perfect boss fight. Is it my favorite or is it the best? No, but it is nearly perfect from a design standpoint, and it's very, very straightforward and simple. It's about as cookie cutter as it gets for a fight, and I'm not even saying that as a criticism. It's literally a circular arena. You have one center boss that you deal damage to when the conditions are met. You put the Ragnaroks down in the middle when it's sparking, and then you just deal damage to the keeper. But there's panzers thrown in every once in a while, or other little attacks that the boss will throw at you in between those sequences that make it more difficult to survive, and not as easy as it sounds. Despite it being a simple premise, it can still be a rather challenging boss fight. I mean, there are gobblegums and certain setups you can run that completely break the boss fight, and that's fine, but it's there are ways you can play it, and it will always be a genuine challenge. And the way it plays out is always, it's predictable, and you know what you're getting yourself into. Again, super super cookie cutter, but extremely effective. Coming up just after that is going to be Malwared or Toten on Cold War, and I think it's pretty similar to like DE in the sense that it's a near perfect boss fight as well. It's a little bit different in the way that it functions. You don't stay in one place. In fact, you transport to basically the entire map as you're fighting the ethereal version of Valentina, and you have to constantly pop her shields in order to deal damage, and there's basically like 5 or 6 different phases of this one. But this boss fight is a lot more interesting than Forsaken. It's way more difficult, and it can genuinely be a challenge. I love pretty much everything about this boss fight, from the way the gameplay mechanics work to the actual boss attacks to the visuals. I love almost everything about it. My only criticism of Malwared or Toten's boss fight is in between the sequences when you're traveling to a new area. You can pretty much take it at your own pace and go and like get armor and other stuff, and I get that's kind of required for the gameplay, but it does reduce the pace a lot, and it kind of feels of less like a boss fight. When you're in complete control of the pace instead of the boss being in control of it, it does deflate the tension a little bit, and I would say that's the only problem I really have with Valentina's fight. Also, at the end, there is a sequence in which you have to transport Klaus all the way to the back of the reactor, and if you're playing it solo or you're just not really paying attention, that sequence might catch you by surprise, and I would still include that as part of the boss fight itself, and it's pretty challenging. By no means is it the most impressive fight I've ever seen, but it's one of Treyarch's stronger boss fights, and if iterated a little bit more or made slightly more complex and challenging, that kind of concept could be very, very effective. Coming up above that, though, we're in our like pretty high tier of boss fights at this point. This is going to be another one of Treyarch's stronger examples. This is Garad Crovie on Black Ops 3, which I believe to this day, when it comes to Treyarch, is still the least completed Easter egg out of all of them. And I think a lot of times the reason for that being is this boss fight in and of itself. You're given a little bit of subversion where you think you're going to be fighting Mech Nikolai at the beginning, but you actually have to fight off the dragon first and foremost, and he assists you in doing so. There's 3 sequences which you have to deal damage to the dragon in its weak spots, and they're pretty straightforward, you know, nothing too crazy there, but the dragon is a bit of a threat. And I vividly remember this boss fight at the time being one of the most challenging for teams. It wasn't like now it is in Zombies, where the first team to get into the boss fight usually completes it first try, or at least 90% of the time. This was back in BO3, where like you would need to take like 3 or 4, maybe even 5 attempts at the boss fight before you completed it with your team. And while people have figured out numerous ways to cheese the boss fight now, and you can get through it very quickly and rapidly if you know what you're doing, and the sequences themselves can be basically broken if you know what's up, it still doesn't take away from the fact that the design is one of Treyarch's best even still. Still regarded widely as one of the most challenging boss fights ever in Zombies by the community as a whole, and I don't think that's really ever gonna change. I don't have very much criticism for this boss fight, if at all. I mean, the only thing I would say is that the way you can play it and cheese it is the only thing that might potentially break the experience. But if you play it how it's, I guess, traditionally supposed to be played, it will give you a run for your money no matter who you are, and it's a really good time. So this is a great example of a good Treyarch boss fight. But up next, with an even better boss fight that has also a very interesting history and backstory, is Zombies in Spaceland. And on replaying this, because I haven't played this in a few years, repeating this boss fight, I got absolutely smoked my first couple of times around, because the boss fight looks deceptively easy, but it's one of the most difficult boss fights that still remain to be tough but fair, right? It's like this boss fight is a prime example of the game not just deciding that you've died just for any reason. It's not artificial. If you made a mistake in Spaceland, you know exactly what you did wrong. You essentially have to deal absurd amounts of damage to an alien, and once you deal enough damage, you'll have a vulnerable window where you have to melee his back and take a fuse off. That's a lot easier said than done, because the way that Spaceland is laid out and the playable space you have to work with, you don't have that much room to navigate, and the zombies end up being a massive threat. Positioning and movement is absolutely everything in this fight. In future zombie titles, they should use Zombie Spaceland as a model to create a boss fight that is difficult and genuinely difficult, but still fair. That being said, however, I do remember when the game launched, they actually had to nerf this boss fight in an update because most people were not able to complete this. They would get to the boss fight and just get absolutely slaughtered. Like, you could try this 20, maybe even 30 times on the pre-patch, and it was nearly impossible to beat. So they had to nerf the boss fight because it was so crazy, but now it's in a really good position. It's been fine-tuned, and it's one of the most fair but challenging boss fights that have ever existed in zombies. Great example and one of my favorite in general. Up next is probably my favorite boss fight in Black Ops 4, but unfortunately is attached to my least favorite map in the game, and this is Voyage of Despair's boss fight. Now, who would have known behind that absolutely horrendous main Easter egg quest is an absolute hidden gem, which is the fight against the giant blue eye. I don't remember what it's called, but this is a absolutely phenomenal, fantastic fight. You have different, like, 5 sequences that take you all around the map. It's kind of like Malwared or Toten in that sense, but this one is just a lot more intelligently designed, and it's significantly more intense. I will say it's a totally different experience solo versus co-op, and I think it's a great solo boss fight. I'm going to draw some comparisons to Malwared or Toten's boss fight because of how similar in structure they are, but in Voyage's fight, the, actual eye and the boss enemy itself is way more of a threat than Valentina ever is in that map, and alongside that, the onslaught of zombies add to the intensity as well. You have a little bit less playable space in this version, and also the boss itself is just designed better because it has a lot of like audio and visual cues that are very clear and precise that indicate certain attacks, and I really like that in boss fights, that you can kind of predict what's coming. It can be a really dangerous move, but if you know how to respond based on an audio or visual indicator, that can, set you up in the right direction to beating the boss fight, even if you're not in the best position to do so. Just like Malwared or Toten as well, the boss fight ends where it begins, but this feels a lot more of a journey than Malwared or Toten's boss fight did, because you also don't have those short breaks in between where you can kind of go do whatever you want. It throws you into the next sequence in Voyage, whether you like it or not, and this is one of those examples as well where the visual spectacle matches its gameplay, and I think that's why it's so aligned and that's why it's so fun. However, my main criticism of this boss fight is you basically only have one way to play it, especially if you're in solo. You literally have to run the Hellion Salvo. You pretty much have to have one of the wonder weapons as well. I mean, obviously you would probably take that in anyways, but you need the launcher. There really isn't a whole lot of weapons you can get the job done with besides this gun, and I think that's unfortunate because of Black Ops 4's intended philosophy, where it's like you can kind of play however you want. That isn't really true in this case, and I think that's my only downfall of it. It's such a shame Black Ops 4 doesn't have like a boss battle rush mode, because I would play this so much if I didn't have to do that dreaded Easter egg quest, but other than that, I really love it. Coming up just above that though, it was so difficult rather to rank this higher than Voyage or vice versa, but ultimately I'm gonna have to put Legion a little bit above, and let me just go and explain why this boss fight is so good. Now, a lot of casual zombie players might not even know what this is or even know that it exists. This is the first Easter egg boss fight in Outbreak, the new mode that Treyarch brought with Cold War, and Legion, who was our main villain here, is essentially a giant tempest, and while this on the surface may not seem like the most interesting or in-depth boss fight, the thing I love about it is it's the opposite of Voyage of Despair in the sense that it's so sandboxy. You can literally play this boss fight exactly however you want, and you will get the results that you get, basically. So, for example, there's a really interesting mechanic in this boss fight where if you bring in a wonder weapon like a ray gun, for example, it's going to make the zombie spawns and everything else a lot more intense than if you didn't. So you can up the intensity on yourself by just bringing in a certain gun. You can also go in on a really high round to make the boss fight as hard as possible, and you can change this to your liking. If you play Legion on the lowest round, on round 5 without any wonder weapons, it's pretty easy. You just deal damage to him while he's vulnerable and break his armor. Do that in 3 different sequences by shooting these orbs and taking his health down 1/3 at a time. Not to mention the boss fight also has a ticking clock element, which adds a little bit of intensity to it. It still gives you a very generous window to beat this, but it adds a little something to the fight. Treyarch's listening to this in their next project. I hope they expand on this concept and this idea for future boss fights, where make them this sandboxy and customizable, where the experience genuinely feels different each and every single time. And I would also say that make the boss scale up in difficulty as the boss gets a little more desperate to survive, right? Like when the Legion is down to his last bar of health, for example, give him some attacks that are incredibly unique and devastating if you don't dodge them or see them coming and react to them. This boss fight is absolutely phenomenal other than that, and it's one of my favorites to play in zombies in general. I would even go so far as to say Legion should now be the base model that they expand on the idea of for future boss fights, similar to like DE was a very cookie cutter boss fight for BO3, and they really kind of played around with that general structure for those fights. They should do the same thing with Legion and expand on that further, because it could be so much more, although Legion in and of itself is one of my favorite boss fights just in gaming, not purely for zombies, but it is amazing if you've never played it. But finally, taking the throne as as the #1 best boss fight in Zombies, and perhaps one of the best boss fights in just gaming as a whole, is the Mephistopheles fight in Infinite Warfare. This boss fight is literally the definition of sauce. It's everything you can want and possibly much more. And do you remember when I said at the beginning of the video that the Beast from Beyond really felt slapped together and just kind of like they cobbled it together in 1 second? Well, the reason for that is because, for the most part, the team was developing this boss fight. And if you've played Infinite Warfare, you do that map's Easter egg. The boss fight you're thrown into directly after the cryptids is Mephistopheles. So it's pretty clear that they focused on this one primarily, while the other one was a little bit of a smokescreen or a red herring. This boss fight, however, the structure is perfect. The way it works is you have to stand in a few different rings while these talismans fill up. They only fill up while you're standing in them, so it's like a time thing. And Mephistopheles has a large number of different attacks that most of them will just straight up insta-kill you. But the difference is, the reason it doesn't feel unfair, they're highly reactable and you know what's coming. So as you play the fight more and more, you're going to learn exactly what to avoid, how to avoid it, and then how to play against it. And then also in between, while filling up these rings, you're given every single enemy to fight in the game in these different waves, and they serve as a little bit of a change of pace from just filling up the rings themselves and doing the talismans. And then you also have to deal damage to Mephistopheles himself in between each of these sequences. Assuming you even make it that far, which is a stretch, and especially playing solo is very difficult to do, if you make it to the end of the talismans, you then have to do a really large sequence of dealing tons of damage to Mephistopheles himself while he spawns literally everything in the game at the same time. I'm surprised the game doesn't crash with how much he spawns at that final phase. But it's everything condensed of what I love in a boss fight. It's brutal, it's unforgiving, it's tough, but it's fair, and every time you play it, it's not like you don't feel discouraged after you lose. You want to go back in and try again because you learned something new or you figured out a different strategy that might help you a little bit better. It's also worth noting that you can't really break this boss fight. Like, there's a lot of ones, especially like BO3 and BO4 and stuff, that depending on what you run in terms of your loadout and equipment, it completely changes the way the boss fight plays. But you can run essentially whatever you want in Mephistopheles and it's still going to give you a challenge. There is no way to cheese it. You're in it for the long haul no matter what you run, but it's up to your preference and exactly your personal skill at the end of the day. I absolutely adore this boss fight and I cannot stress it enough. If you've never played it, I highly recommend you do. If you have access to Infinite Warfare, this is a good reason to go and play it if you haven't, but I hope they do more stuff like this in Zombies. This is what we need. It's maybe not the most beginner friendly. Obviously, I don't want it in a launch map, but as a series finale, this was literally perfect, and I really do hope they iterate on something like this. But anyways, guys, that is my list of the best boss fights in Call of Duty Zombies ranked. Let me know what you thought about my list down below in the comment section. If you agree, if you disagree, I would love to hear from you guys. But anyways, drop a like if you enjoyed the video. This took a really long time to make, and be sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel for more Zombies content like this. And I also stream over on Twitch if you want to go follow me over there. I stream Zombies quite frequently if you want to come hang out. It's a good time, but other than that, I will see you guys very soon in the next one. Take it easy. I'm gonna go. Peace out.